Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to move along. The voice was sharp. It was young. It was filled with the kind of unearned authority that comes standard with a crisp uniform and a recent graduation from boot camp. The old man on the bench did not turn. His eyes remained fixed on the long, gray silhouette of the destroyer docked at Pier 7. She was a marvel of modern engineering, all sharp angles and muted power, bristling with systems he could barely comprehend. Her new paint smelled of purpose. "Did you hear me, old-timer?" the young Marine insisted, stepping directly into the old man's line of sight. The name tag on his immaculate Desert Marpat uniform read Davies. He was a lance corporal, barely 20 years old, with a jawline set in permanent defiance and eyes that saw the world in black and white regulations. The old man, Elias Thorne, finally shifted his gaze. It was a slow, deliberate movement, as if pulling his attention from a great distance. His eyes were the color of a faded sea chart, mapped with the fine lines of 9 decades. "She's a fine vessel," Elias said, his voice a dry rasp, like leaves skittering across pavement. Lance Corporal Davies crossed his arms. The posture was a physical manifestation of impatience. "That's great. But this is a restricted area for the commissioning ceremony. Gold braid only. You're not on the list." Elias wore a simple, worn windbreaker against the San Diego morning chill, a pair of khaki trousers, and a faded VFW cap that had seen better days. He looked like 1,000 other elderly veterans who haunted the edges of military bases, lost in memories of a bygone era. "A relic." "I'm just watching," Elias said, his voice quiet, unthreatening. "You can just watch from outside the security perimeter," Davies countered, his tone dripping with condescension. "Now, are you going to move, or do I have to help you?" Elias did not answer. He simply looked at the young man, his expression unreadable. This stillness, this utter lack of reaction, was more infuriating to Davies than any argument would have been. It was as if the Marine's authority was a wave breaking against a stone, having no effect at all. "All right, that's it," Davies sighed, reaching down. "Up you get, Grandpa." He grabbed the old man's arm. The fabric of the windbreaker sleeve was thin. Underneath, his grip found not the frail, bony arm he expected, but something dense and hard, like old rope wrapped around a steel cable. As he pulled, the sleeve slid up Elias's forearm, revealing a patch of weathered skin. And the tattoo. It was not a modern, artful piece of ink. It was crude, faded to a blurry blue-green, the lines thick and uneven as if drawn by an unsteady hand in poor light. It depicted a simple trident, the kind a child might draw, crossed with a single, stylized feather. Encircling this symbol were 7 small, irregular stars. Davy stopped pulling. He stared at the mark. He let out a short, derisive laugh. "What is that? Some prison ink? You get that in a garage with a guitar string and a 9-volt. The touch, the pressure of the young Marine's fingers on his arm, sent a jolt through Elias. Not of pain, but of memory. The world of polished decks and crisp uniforms dissolved. He smelled it first. The thick, metallic scent of blood and cordite, mixed with the cloying sweetness of rotting jungle vegetation and the sharp tang of salt air. He felt the grit of black sand under his fingernails. He heard the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of a desperate heart, his own. He was no longer an old man on a sunny pier. He was 19 years old, crouched in a waterlogged foxhole on an island that had no name on any official map. Rain, thick and warm as blood, plastered his hair to his skull. Next to him, a boy named Sammy, who would never see 20, was meticulously sharpening a captured bayonet. Another boy, a quiet giant from Montana they called Stonewall, was preparing the ink. Gunpowder from a dud cartridge, mixed with sterile water from his canteen in a helmet liner. The needle was a sharpened nail, wrapped in thread for grip. "Hold still, Eli," Stonewall had mumbled, his own arm already bearing the fresh, weeping mark. "This is gonna hurt." It did, but the physical pain was a distant echo of the other, deeper pain. The pain for the 7. 7 empty bunks on the transport ship. 7 faces that lived only in the flickering firelight of their memory. The trident for the sea they had crossed. The feather for the silence in which they moved. The 7 stars for the brothers they had buried in the volcanic sand. It was not a tattoo. It was a scar. A promise. A eulogy written in skin. I said, are you deaf? The voice of Lance Corporal Davies shattered the memory. Elias was back on the pier. The sun was warm on his face. The smell was of salt and fresh paint. Davies was still holding his arm, his fingers tight on the faded ink. I'm not asking again. Let's go. Further down the pier, Gunnery Sergeant Wallace watched the exchange with a growing sense of unease. He was a man of 30 years in the Corps, a veteran of Fallujah and Sanjin. He knew the look of a squared-away Marine, and Davies was the poster boy. He also knew the look of trouble. Something about the scene was profoundly wrong. It wasn't just the disrespect, though that grated on him. It was the old man. The absolute, unshakable calm. Wallace had seen that stillness before. He'd seen it in battle-hardened Special Forces operators. He'd seen it in men who had looked death in the eye so many times they no longer flinched. It was a stillness that radiated a kind of gravity, a silent power that the loud, posturing Lance Corporal was utterly blind to. Wallace saw Davies grab the man's arm. He saw the flash of the strange tattoo. He didn't recognize the symbol, but his gut, an organ he had learned to trust more than any intelligence report, screamed at him. He turned away, pulling his phone from his pocket. He kept his back to the scene, pretending to check messages. He dialed the number for the base command center. This is Gunnery Sergeant Wallace at Pier 7, he said, his voice low and urgent. Patch me through to the Admiral's aide. Now, there was a moment of hesitation on the other end, then a click. Lieutenant Evans, a clipped, impatient voice answered. The Admiral's flag lieutenant was known for his efficiency and his utter lack of patience for anything that wasted his boss's time. This had better be important, Gunny. Sir, Wallace began, choosing his words carefully. We have a civilian in the restricted area for the commissioning. He's refusing to leave. One of my Marines is interacting with him. And you're calling me for this? Evans's voice was laced with ice. Have your Marine handle it. That's what security details are for. Sir, with all due respect, something isn't right about this one. Wallace pressed, his gut twisting. The man is old. Very old. But he's not confused. He's just still. Evans let out an exasperated sigh. What's his name, Gunnery Sergeant? Wallace walked back towards the confrontation. Davies was now trying to physically pull the old man from the bench. What's your name, sir? Wallace asked, his voice respectful, a stark contrast to Davies's aggression. The old man looked at him. For the first time, Wallace saw a flicker of something in those pale eyes. Not anger, not fear. Weariness. A deep, profound weariness. Thorne, the old man rasped. Elias Thorne. Wallace related into the phone. His name is Elias Thorne, Lieutenant. He then added the detail that had been bothering him most. And sir, he has a tattoo on his forearm. Looks homemade. A trident and a feather, inside a circle of 7 stars. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It was not a thoughtful pause. It was the deafening, heart-stopping silence of a dropped bomb. Wallace thought the call had been cut. He pulled the phone from his ear to check the screen. Gunny. Lieutenant Evans's voice was unrecognizable. The arrogance was gone. The impatience was gone. It had been replaced by a tone of pure, unadulterated shock, bordering on panic. Gunny, are you there? I'm here, sir, Wallace said, his own heart starting to pound. Listen to me very carefully, Evans said, his words now clipped and precise, like machine gun fire. You will stand down your Marine. You will ensure that no one, and I mean no one, lays a hand on Mr. Thorne. You will not let him leave. The Admiral is on his way. I repeat, the Admiral is en route. We are code 1 inch. The line went dead. Wallace stared at his phone, then at the old man. Elias Thorne. The name meant nothing to him. The tattoo meant nothing to him. But it meant something to the Admiral. Something big enough to trigger a code 1 response. Davies. Wallace's voice was a crack of thunder. Stand down. On the double. Lance Corporal Davies, who had just managed to get the old man to his feet, froze. He looked over, confused and irritated. But Gunny, I said stand down. Wallace barked, striding over and placing himself between his Marine and the old man. Step back. Now, Davies, bewildered but obedient to the iron in the Gunny's tone, took a reluctant step back. He shot a venomous glare at Elias, as if this were all his fault. Less than a minute later, they heard it. Not sirens. That would have been too common. This was the sound of raw power. the deep-throated rumble of heavy engines moving at a speed far exceeding the base limit. A gleaming black command vehicle, flanked by two black SUVs with tinted windows, tore down the pier access road. They didn't slow, they braked hard, tires screaming in protest, stopping in a perfectly aligned formation a dozen yards from the bench. Doors flew open. Marines in dress blues, armed and alert, emerged from the escort vehicles, forming a crisp perimeter. The rear door of the command car opened. Out stepped Rear Admiral Marcus Cole. He was a tall, imposing man whose face looked like it had been carved from granite. His uniform was a constellation of ribbons and medals, a testament to a career spent in the crucible of command. His eyes, cold and blue, swept the scene, and his face was a mask of controlled fury. He ignored the saluting officers who had rushed over. He ignored the base commander who was jogging to meet him. He ignored Gunnery Sergeant Wallace standing at rigid attention. His entire focus, his entire being, was aimed like a torpedo at one single point on the pier. The old man in the VFW cap. Admiral Cole strode forward, his polished shoes eating up the concrete. Each step was heavy with purpose, with a terrifying, unspoken weight. The air on the pier grew still and silent. Every sailor, every Marine, every civilian guest stopped what they were doing and watched, captivated by the unfolding drama. He stopped exactly 3 feet in front of Elias Thorne. He did not speak. With a motion so sharp and precise it seemed to cut the air, Rear Admiral Marcus Cole brought his right hand up in a salute. It was not a casual gesture of respect. It was the salute of a warrior to a king. It was a salute of profound, soul-deep reverence. His back was ramrod straight. His eyes were locked on Elias. His voice, when it came, was a booming baritone that echoed across the water, filled with an emotion that no one present had ever heard from him before. "Mr. Thorne," the Admiral declared, his voice thick with awe. "It is an honor, sir." Lance Corporal Davies's jaw went slack. His brain simply refused to process what his eyes were seeing. An admiral, saluting a confused old man. Elias Thorne looked at the Admiral and gave a slow, tired nod. Cole held his salute, turning his head just enough to address the stunned onlookers, though his gaze remained fixed on Elias. "You people see an old man," he began, his voice ringing with power. "You see someone who you think is in the way. Let me tell you what I see. I see a living monument. I see a ghost. This is Elias Thorne. He was the point man for a 7-man unit in the Pacific that never officially existed. A unit so secret, their records were personally burned by the Secretary of the Navy in 1946. They were called the First Wave Raiders. Unofficially, they were known as the Ghosts of the Coral Sea. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The name was the stuff of legends, a whispered myth in the barracks and ready rooms, a story told to frighten new recruits. No one believed it was real. On the night of August 8, 1942, the Admiral continued, his voice a storyteller's cadence. These 7 men, armed with little more than knives and their own indomitable will, slipped ashore on an enemy-held island. Their mission was to sabotage a fuel depot that was set to refuel an entire battle fleet preparing to ambush our carriers. They were discovered. For 3 days, they fought a running battle against an entire battalion. They were outnumbered 200 to 1, but they led the enemy on a chase through the jungle, away from their real target. On the 4th night, wounded and exhausted, Mr. Thorne and 2 others doubled back. They rigged the depot with homemade charges and sank or crippled every tanker in the harbor. They saved the American fleet. They turned the tide of the entire naval campaign. The Admiral paused, his eyes glowing with fierce pride. Of the 7 men who went ashore, only 1 came back. This one. He carried the unit's last survivor, who held the intelligence, on his back for 2 miles through enemy patrols to the extraction point, while he himself was bleeding from 3 separate gunshot wounds. He held off an enemy platoon with his last 3 clips of ammunition so the boat could get away. Cole finally, reluctantly, dropped his salute. He took a step closer to Elias. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor, for the Navy Cross, for every medal they could think of. He refused them all. He said the only heroes were the 6 men he left behind. He asked for only one thing, to go home and be forgotten. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with shame and newfound reverence. Then, the Admiral's gaze shifted. It moved from Elias Thorne and landed, like a physical blow, on Lance Corporal Davies. The temperature on the pier plummeted. The Admiral's face, which had been filled with emotional pride, transformed back into a mask of cold, lethal fury. His voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow louder and more terrifying than his previous booming commands. "You," he hissed. "Lance Corporal." Davies flinched as if he had been struck. He could not speak. His throat was closed with a knot of pure terror. "You put your hands on this man?" Cole asked, the question hanging in the air like a death sentence. Davies could only manage a pathetic, jerky nod. "You mocked his ink." The Admiral didn't wait for an answer. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached down and began to unbutton the cuff of his own pristine, white dress uniform shirt. He rolled the starched fabric up his forearm, past a gold watch, revealing skin weathered by decades of sun and sea. There, on the Admiral's own arm, was the exact same tattoo. A crude trident. A single feather. 7 small stars. It was older, more faded than Elias's, but it was unmistakably the same. "This garage ink, Lance Corporal," Admiral Cole whispered, his eyes boring into Davies's soul, "is the sigil of the first-wave raiders. My grandfather was the man Mr. Thorne carried on his back to the extraction point, the man whose life he saved. He died 2 days later, but not before he told my father everything. Not before he made my father promise that our family would never forget." Cole stepped so close to Davies their noses were almost touching. "You don't earn this mark. You survive it. It is a symbol of sacrifice so profound, of a legacy so sacred, that you are not worthy to breathe the same air as it. You mistook age for weakness. You saw history and called it a nuisance. You have disgraced that uniform you wear, a uniform paid for by the blood and sacrifice of men like Elias Thorne." Davies's face had gone chalk white. His legs trembled. He looked as if he might crumble into dust. It was then that Elias Thorne moved. He reached out a frail, steady hand and placed it on the Admiral's rigid arm. "Marcus," he said, his voice soft but clear. "Enough." The Admiral flinched at the sound of his first name, his fury instantly receding, replaced by a look of deference. Elias turned his gentle, sea-charred eyes to the terrified young Marine. "The boy was just doing his job," he said quietly. "He's young. He sees the rules, not the story behind them. It's not his fault." Admiral Cole looked from Elias back to Davies, his expression a conflict of rage and respect for the old man's wishes. "No, sir," the Admiral said, his voice firm but no longer lethal. "His job is to see. His job is to understand that the rules are written on a foundation of what came before." He turned to Gunnery Sergeant Wallace. "Gunny." "Sir." Wallace snapped to attention. "Take this Lance Corporal and his entire security team to the base library. They are confined to the history section. They will not eat, they will not sleep, until they have handwritten a 10,000-word report on Operation Sundown, the First Wave Raiders, and the complete biography of Elias Thorne. They will then present it to me, personally. At 0500 tomorrow," he paused. "And Gunny?" "Effective immediately, the mandatory course on Marine Corps ethics and history for all incoming recruits at MCRD San Diego has a new name. It's now the Thorne Protocol. See to it." "Aye, aye, sir," Wallace replied, a grim satisfaction on his face. Months later, the San Diego sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Corporal Davies, his uniform now bearing a second stripe, sat in a quiet, off-base diner, nursing a cup of coffee. He was a different man. Quieter, more thoughtful. The arrogance had been stripped from him, layer by painful layer, in the dusty archives of the base library. The bell above the diner door jingled. In walked Elias Thorne. He moved slowly, leaning on a simple wooden cane, but his eyes were alert. He took a seat in a booth by the window, the same one he sat in every Tuesday. Davies's heart hammered against his ribs. He took a deep breath, stood up, and walked over to the old man's table. He stood at a perfect, respectful position of attention. "Mr. Thorne." "Sir." Elias looked up from his menu, his expression mild. He recognized the boy. He had seen the shame in his eyes that day, and he saw the humility in them now. "Sir," Davies said, his voice thick with sincerity, "I wanted to apologize. For my ignorance. For my disrespect. There's no excuse for how I acted. I was blind. I'm sorry. Elias Thorne looked at the young corporal for a long moment. He saw the genuine remorse. He saw the lesson that had been brutally but effectively learned. A small, knowing smile touched his lips. He gestured with his hand to the empty seat across from him. "Sit down, son," he said, his voice a quiet rasp. "The coffee's good here." Davies hesitated, then slid into the booth. Elias stirred his own coffee, the spoon clinking softly against the ceramic. "The uniform doesn't make the man," he said, not looking up. "The man makes the uniform. Never forget who came before you. Never forget the weight of the history you carry on your shoulders." He finally looked up, his pale eyes meeting the young Marine's. "That's all the respect anyone can ask for,"